Hello and welcome to the August 2016 episode of This Week in Germany, the podcast about German culture, society and politics. I'm Daniel Winter. Coming up, after the violent attacks in Würzburg and Munich, is mass immigration to blame? Alternative medicine. Why are medical doctors prescribing useless drugs to their patients? Plus, we take a look behind the walls of the Stasi prison Hohenschönhausen. So let's get started with our 108th episode. Throughout July, you couldn't help turning on the news and feeling down about Europe. The attack in Nice made clear that a madman can kill scores of people without the need for a firearm. It's suspected the man behind the attacks had Islamist motives. Germans wondered whether they would be next. Then came an attack on a train near the South German city of Würzburg, in which 5 people were injured. The 17-year-old Afghan refugee who perpetrated the attack was shot and killed by police. The investigation is also following an Islamist intention. And finally, in Munich, a German-born 18-year-old killed 9 people before turning the pistol on himself. He apparently had an obsession with mass murderers, but here there was apparently no link to Islamism. At least one hasn't been discovered so far. So what are we to make of all of this? While reporting on the Würzburg attack, I personally received dozens of hateful messages, Islamophobic messages, with people blaming Angela Merkel's immigration policy for what happened. Well, Olkan Hiller has been following these stories for us, and he joins me now in Twig Towers, in our studio. Hi.
I'm glad to be in the Twig Towers penthouse, Daniel.
Penthouse suite.
Exactly.
So now you've got out the hot tub.
Yes, the champagne has been drunk.
Okay, then you can tell us about these awful events which have been happening. Is Angela Merkel's open-door refugee policy to blame for these attacks?
I think this is unfortunately a common but actually very dangerous misconception. Like you stated, the Munich attack was actually perpetrated by a German national. Now, he did have Iranian heritage, but his motivation was definitely not Islamic extremism or anything in that regard. In actuality, they found out that his influence more so was Anders Breivik, the Norwegian terrorist who conducted the horrific attacks in Oslo on the 22nd of July in 2011. So that was his motivation, so there's definitely no link to Islam in that attack. If you look in a more general sense within regards to crime rate in Germany in relation to immigration or refugees, there is no representation or no increase disproportionately to the increase in population within Germany. There's been a number of reports in regards to this. For one, the Bundeskriminalamt, or the Federal Criminal Police Office, they released a summary to The Independent, which showed that 82% of offences by immigrants were non-violent, consisting mostly of theft, counterfeiting, or travelling on public transport without a ticket, which is not just related to immigrants either. I think a lot of people around the world travel on public transport without tickets. So this is definitely not on the high scale of crime or the most important crimes within Germany. But I think more importantly, there was a report by the German Federal Office of Criminal Investigation, also known as the BKA, that announced that crimes committed by refugees stood at the same level as those by native Germans. So the BKA did note that, there might have been a marked spike of crime at the arrival centres for refugees, but this is more to do with lack of resources and lack of space than an inherent criminal nature within refugees or something like that. What was also noted was that crimes committed against asylum seekers and refugees are at an all-time high. So there's more than 1,000 offences against migrant accommodation in the last year, and including 177 violent incidents, 4 times the figure in 2014.
But what do you say to the people who say attacks like these, maybe not Munich, but Würzburg and Nice, for example, if it weren't for Angela Merkel letting in all of these refugees, then these people would still be alive today. So therefore we should shut the borders. What do you say to them?
I mean, in Nice, this was a man who lived in France for years. So, I mean, it's more to do with once people arrive in Germany, how are they treated? How are they regarded? Is there enough integration? Are they welcomed into society? If they're isolated, this makes them a much easier target to be radicalized, to be turned against the country where they've come to escape the warfare or famine or whatever it is. So I think the biggest problem is not that they've been let into the country, it's that they aren't given the resources once they have arrived to become an actual part of society.
Yes, and also I imagine that if we close the borders, people who really want to terrorize will find a way. And if we look to Anders Breivik, who you mentioned, he is the biggest mass murderer in Norwegian history since the Second World War. No Islamist motive. He wasn't an Islamist, and yet this madman killed scores of people. And so we don't need to be pointing out Muslims as being the problem. But if we look at Europe now, what do we know about the kind of places where attacks are occurring? Where should we be afraid? Do we need to be afraid of going to France? Do we need to be afraid of being in Germany now? Because these seem to be the obvious targets.
It would appear that way. But actually, according to Interpol, Britain suffered the most terrorist attacks in 2015. Of the 211 attacks in 2015, 103 terrorist attacks were carried out on British soil last year, mostly regarding Northern Ireland and separatist movements like the Republicans and the Unionists. France did come in second with 72 and Spain third with 25, but the most were committed on British soil. Now, I mean, it should be noted that the death rate regarding to these attacks don't correlate. So, I mean, the death rate for France was much higher due to the number of deaths with each attack. But just on paper, statistically, there have been more attacks in Britain. And this is something that has been going on for years.
It just helps you to put it into perspective.
Exactly.
When you hear this. Yeah. Okay, so but when you talk about France, and we've seen the attacks in Germany, why is this becoming so bad now? I mean, it must be due to the recent immigration, right? I mean, we didn't see these kinds of attacks or this amount of terrorism before.
It's funny, you can see this on social media, people saying, how has it come to this? How has it gotten so bad? But actually, if you look back over the last 30 years, the worst period for Europe for terrorism was the 1970s. You had groups like Baader-Meinhof, you had the Red Brigade, you had large increases in both the number of attacks and fatalities. In fact, 1988 was the worst year for terrorism in Europe with the Pan Am Lockerbie bombing.
Which wasn't an Islamist attack.
Which wasn't an Islamist attack. So the idea that we have now suddenly come to this point in Europe where it's terrorism all the time and it's just getting worse and worse, it's actually dropping down, both the number of attacks and fatalities since the 70s. I mean, if you look in Northern Ireland, they had the Troubles in the 70s, you had all over Europe, you had the Baader-Meinhof. These attacks were frequent, you had bomb threats in schools. It has actually improved. The problem is we are exposed to this so much more now. We have internet, we have social media, we have the news all around us. We can't escape it. So it seems like you can never turn away without seeing something about terrorism. But that's not just an increase in the terrorism, it's an increase of the reporting, it's an increase of exposure to these news articles and these news stories.
So people should stop being so hysterical then. They should think back. They should not have such short memories. Think back to the 70s where it wasn't Muslims, and yet there was ETA, and there was the IRA, and there was the RAF, the Rote Armee-Fraktion in Germany. You know, white people, non-Muslims, committing vastly more terrorism than happens today.
Exactly.
All right, Olken Hiller, thank you very much for breaking that down for us. In just a second, we'll get to the news in brief, and then we'll have an investigation into alternative or complementary medicine, depending on what you want to call it, and our trip to a Stasi prison. But first, if you'd like to keep this podcast going, why not buy us a beer? The average price of a beer in a bar in Germany is just €3.89, so if you can afford that, why not set up a monthly donation? Go to thisweekingermany.de/beermoney. After all, what other podcast gives you in-depth insights into Germany's news, politics, society and culture in English? Just €3.89 a month, thisweekingermany.de/beermoney. Thank you so much for your generosity. Now it's time for your news in brief. Britain's Prime Minister made her first official foreign visit to Berlin. Theresa May met with Chancellor Angela Merkel for a discussion on Brexit, where May was keen to emphasise the UK's continuing close diplomatic and trade relationship with Germany. The two leaders said at a press conference that it was a good sign that two women were in such high offices in their respective countries.
And you asked how we'd got on in our first getting on in our first meeting. I think what is very important is we have two women here who have got on and had a very constructive discussion. Two women who, if I may say so, I think get on with the job and both want to deliver the best possible results for the people of the UK and the people of Germany.
Genau, dem schließe ich mich.
Exactly. I can only subscribe to that and underline it in full.
And speaking of Brexit, Germany is poised to pick up the slack caused by Britain leaving the EU. If London's financial hub will find it more difficult to trade with Europe, companies could move to Frankfurt. It's estimated between 10 and 20,000 workers could head to the Eurozone's financial capital post-Brexit. The mayor of this city, Peter Feldman, says he's both crying and laughing when it comes to the result of the EU referendum. But that's not all. Startup firms from London may be considering a move to Berlin, famous for its so-called Silicon Alley of companies. Berlin's Senator for Economics and Technology said startups know they need to be in the EU to grow. The capital is already popular, with more demand for office space than they have room for, but Berlin is building more to help accommodate the new firms who want to be in Europe's hipster paradise. Supporters of Turkish President Erdogan held a demonstration in the city of Cologne. Media reported 30,000 attendees, unsurprising as Germany has the largest population with a Turkish background outside of Turkey. The demonstrators showed support of Erdogan's measures in reaction to an attempted coup in the country. This month it was reported that 3 cancer patients at a clinic in Germany died as a result of their treatment. The clinic was offering them so-called complementary treatment instead of chemotherapy. Alternative and complementary medicine use methods of treating someone that haven't been scientifically proven. These can include homeopathy, chiropractic and acupuncture, to name just 3. And in Germany, health insurers often pay for these kinds of treatments. Many practitioners of these therapies reject the scientific method as a way of measuring how effective a treatment is. We asked you about these therapies on Twitter. 54% of you say that they should be regulated. 34% say they should be banned. But just 12% of you think that scientifically unproven healing therapies should be unregulated. In fact, there's a lot of debate over whether these kinds of therapies are ethical or whether they're fooling patients in Germany. So I decided to investigate. Now, I'm skeptical about the whole alternative medicine thing, so I've decided to come here to Mitte in Berlin and find out from a healer directly about what he does and whether it's ethical.
My name is Rainer Krell. I'm a Heilpraktiker, which is the German word for, maybe you would translate it as a naturopath. So I'm not a medical doctor. Heilpraktiker means in Germany it's like the second profession within the medical field that is allowed to diagnose and treat diseases.
Mr. Krell offers a range of therapies from his practice in Berlin. To be a naturopath, he has to pass an examination from the local health authority. In that way, the complementary medicine industry is regulated in Germany. Naturopaths are not legally allowed to directly treat certain diseases, such as cancer, and mustn't discourage patients from seeing a doctor. What sets his method out from that of a medical doctor is the time he takes in consultation.
Typically, people come in for a first interview, which takes like 90 minutes, sometimes 2 hours. So I'm asking a lot of questions. That's one thing. Then I also look at people. I do, the regular things like using a stethoscope, checking blood pressure, all these things. And then, based on that, the treatment is laid out.
After getting to know his patient's problem in detail, he then offers treatments such as homeopathy or acupuncture. But his therapies are not scientifically proven. They take advantage of the placebo effect. Basically, when an ineffectual treatment makes a person perceive an improvement in their condition. The comfort of a medical practitioner taking time to talk with the patient and giving them treatment personally has been shown to actually help patients recover faster. But all scientifically proven medicine measures itself against placebo. Basically, your drug or therapy must be several times more effective than placebo, or it is otherwise no better than simply prescribing sugar pills. So what about when you're in the business of prescribing treatments which science says do not work? Isn't it unethical?
I think that it's not up to me to have anybody or to decide for anybody else. So people have to decide themselves what they want to do.
But you are promoting this, though.
Yeah, based on my experience. And you refer to studies that show that homeopathy doesn't work. I can refer to studies that show that homeopathy does work.
Krell doesn't push for treatment entirely by unscientific means, what's called alternative medicine. Instead, he believes his work should fit together with mainstream treatments, and that's what's called complementary medicine.
I would also never tell a patient, get rid of the drugs the doctor prescribed, and now you take what I give you. Because for me, it's not this or that, it's the combination of both. So it's more, my approach is more the complementary idea than either this or that. So I know that there are some doctors even who say, get rid of everything, and if you have cancer, don't take the chemotherapy, just do this instead. It's something I would never say.
So while this kind of therapy isn't proven to work, anecdotally, he believes his patients leave happier and healthier than before, whatever the data might say about these therapies. If it worked, if it was proven, we can talk about, well, there's these studies or those studies. We don't have any papers in front of us to look at that. But if it worked, it would be orthodox medicine.
No, because the studies, once again, you're referring to are studies that are based on the system that we know from natural science, and that they're valid, they do work, but that doesn't mean that there can't be any other ways of setting up studies that also show that things can work or not work.
I decided to find out more on the scientific arguments for and against complementary medicine directly from a medical doctor. Jutta Hübner works for the German Cancer Society and is a member of the Drug Commission for the German Medical Association. I asked her about the hurdle any treatment has to overcome for her to recommend it to a patient. When it comes to any drug at all, what would you say is the gold standard of testing for a medication?
Well, the gold standard surely is the randomized controlled study, which we can make with most drugs.
And do homeopathic treatments, for example, fit this gold standard?
No, there have been several attempts, but none of these studies has shown any efficacy of the globally. It's a mere placebo effect.
So would you personally, as a doctor, recommend that people, we're at the German Cancer Society here, would you recommend cancer patients, for example, use alternative medicine and alternative treatments such as homeopathy?
No, surely not. First of all, not as alternative. There are really some homeopaths in Germany who say that they can fight cancer with homeopathy, and this is really a fraud. The other way, you could say, well, if you take it besides, for example, using chemotherapy or radiotherapy, this might do no harm, but I'm not so sure, because people learning that this is a concept we accept might set their hope in this type of medicine, even in case they are in a more palliative situation. And this hinders adhering, for example, to concepts of good palliative care.
And here we run into another issue. There are many medical doctors in Germany, fully qualified in orthodox medicine, who also include complementary therapies in their list of services. Surely, it cannot be ethical for a doctor to offer something that science says doesn't work.
I think this is an important point. To my opinion, it really is unethical to prescribe things if I know that they don't work, even if people ask for them. We know that some physicians, they themselves believe in these types of medicine, and they do the courses, for example, from the medical associations. So I won't say that they really work without an ethical fundament, but if you really try to dive into the facts, you see what's happening.
So if these therapies don't work, why are German health insurers willing to pay out for them?
There are two different reasons for that. The one is that legislature says that they have to, and the other one is that it's very attractive for these companies to offer additional concepts because it attracts young, healthy insurees who do not cost much.
We know that the placebo effect can help patients. That's how therapies like homeopathy can show simple improvement in the well-being of a patient. But if this stems not from the treatment itself, but from the concern and empathy of the doctor in a longer consultation, for example, couldn't health insurers stand to gain by paying out for longer consultations? Fewer people would go back to the doctors with repeat problems, therefore cutting costs in the long run.
From the side of the insurance companies, they don't have the power to choose for themselves. They can make some smaller projects, for example, for homeopathy or anything like that. But in the whole system, they are not able to decide how they want to distribute the money. A second point might be that all the system is looking for profit, or trying not to have too much dispenses from the side of the insurers. So they are afraid if one insurance company would change their system, that all the ill people would come to them and the other people would take the more or less expensive company. So for the single company, there is no reason to change anything.
I decided to end my chat with Dr. Hübner with a very simple question. Is it right, is it ethical for a medical doctor to be prescribing complementary medicines such as homeopathy and acupuncture?
Alternative medicine, no. Complementary, he might give an advice, but no prescription because the patient can do it by himself or herself.
So, here's what we've learned. Germany not only allows complementary therapy, but its laws and insurance system is made to accommodate it. You have to look at it as the lesser of two evils. Allowing freedom of choice while ensuring the practice is regulated is far better than an outright ban, which would be difficult and impractical to enforce. While I'd say the current system supports these therapies too much, the state is essentially lending legitimacy to feelings over facts. But it has got one thing right. Naturopaths must encourage patients to see medical doctors too. But in Germany, some medical doctors have an interest in prescribing complementary medicine. That's a problem which blurs the line between medicine and emotion. Under the current system, that won't go away anytime soon. Now it's time for Destination Germany, the part of the show where you can experience a part of the country that's well worth visiting. This month, Olken went to Berlin's former Stasi prison in Hohenschönhausen. Here's what he discovered.
And in an isolation cell like that, the only thing you can do is sit on your bed, wait and think. This is pure psychological torture, to be let in your fear doing absolutely nothing.
That was the voice of one of the tour guides from Hohenschönhausen Memorial in Berlin, a former Soviet prison, and later the remand prison for the East German Ministry of State Security. better known as Stasi.
You had here a Nazi welfare organization, so it had nothing to do with death, torture, prison. It was actually a kitchen here. They were cooking food, and then they were giving food to the population who was living here in the neighborhood, so people had something to eat during the war. That's basically what the Nazis were doing here. And after the war, when the Nazis were gone, the Soviets took over this place. And the first year before the prison was built, you had actually a transit camp here. And then they built a prison. And that's what we are going to visit today, the last 3 parts of the chronology, the prison we had here. You are going to see there's a huge difference between the Soviets and the Stasi, how they have treated prisoners. Somehow we can say that conditions were better under the Stasi. Of course, I'm not saying it was a good thing to be in prison here, that it was pleasant to be here, not at all. But physical conditions have changed. They have evolved under the Stasi. We are going to see that, how they have changed, why they have changed.
From November 1946 until April 1951, the building was a Soviet prison with harsh conditions. You can see this as the tour takes you around the underground cells, which they named the submarine.
So first was this basement. Well, remember, under the Nazis here in this building, you had a kitchen. The kitchen was above. Here it was just a basement to store food, material. And my point here is to say that it was never supposed to become a prison, with hundreds of people in here. So conditions were never there, actually, to have people in here with ventilation, hygiene, and so on. So, of course, it was then very difficult for prisoners.
From April 1951 until the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, the prison was run by the Stasi, the East German secret police. They expanded the complex considerably, and it became a major remand centre where many interrogations were performed. Thousands of political prisoners passed through this jail, including pretty much any prominent critic of the East German government. By this point, the physical conditions had improved somewhat, but the use of psychological torture became the main tool of choice for the Stasi.
So here, one interrogation room, amongst many others. You have seen the hallway, there are a lot of them. We have here in this prison around 110 interrogation rooms. It's a lot. When prisoners were being interrogated, it was usually on the stool or sometimes at the end of the table. And here, remember, we're talking about psychological methods to get information from prisoners. And they were using several tricks to do that. For example, one thing that was used was to have a very long interrogation. So at some point they were just too tired. Especially the interrogations after the arrest, the first interrogations, they could be extremely long. Many prisoners have been at least interrogated 24 hours.
So all in all, the tour showed me and the rest of the group how the GDR operated and how it attempted to control its population using psychological tactics to confuse and break down the population. What makes this place unique, though, is that a lot of the information that's now available to the tours come directly from former prisoners, allowing you to really get a feel of what it was like to be detained there. In fact, some of the tour guides themselves are former prisoners, so you can hear about the conditions firsthand. The tour definitely left impressions on members of the group.
I didn't know anything about it till I got to Berlin and I saw, some brochures on the web and came, and I thought it was very good. She was excellent, and I recommend it for everybody.
But maybe the most interesting information I took away from my visit was after the tour, when I asked about the Stasi agents and if they still lived around the prison, like they did while the prison was operational.
Some of them, I can't give you a number, how much are there here, but definitely, and also further away from the prison. I've heard that sometimes some people are looking for the prison to visit, and I don't know if it's from Stasi agent, but sometimes when they ask people in the street, so where's the prison? Sometimes they say, well, which prison? There's nothing to visit here. So I don't know, maybe it shows that still now not everyone is accepting here in the neighborhood what we are doing here. Right. It could be a sign.
If you'd like to find out more information about visiting Hohenschönhausen, you can simply go to our website www.thisweekingermany.de, where we'll have links to more info.
And that brings us to the end of this episode of This Week in Germany. Remember to head over to thisweekingermany.de/beermoney to make a small monthly pledge and help keep us afloat. If you're pining for more from Germany, we update our Twitter page on a regular basis. The links to all our social media is on our website. That's thisweekingermany.de. This episode was produced and presented by me, Daniel Winter, with reporting and production support from Olken Hiller. Thank you very much for listening. We'll be back again in a few weeks with another episode of This Week in Germany.